Sometimes I think about life, love, war, peace. Sometimes I think about sex, the weather, platform shoes, and old stock footage. Sometimes I think life is a highway, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I think if this world gets any more messed up, my head will explode.
Same. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, because there were so many stories that I didn't have time to cover this year. And, well, that really bothers me. So I asked an expert for help, our special guest from the channel What's Bothering Me Today.
Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today.
We picked 10 stories that weren't all good news exactly, but at the very least represent something salvageable from 2020. I think it's important that we harvest good news along the way to utopia that show there's a growing movement on the left that we can plug into. Now, these are all complex issues, and we'll really only be scratching the surface in this video, so please leave a comment below telling us how we completely misrepresented the issues, and this is all a pipeline to centrist reformism or whatever. This is why we can't have nice things! Speaking of pipelines, let's lead with one of the most nuanced examples, the Wet'suwet'en and Coastal GasLink conflict. Here's the quick version. In response to a BC Supreme Court injunction to allow Coastal GasLink workers onto the land, the RCMP raided the Gidimt'en checkpoint camp in February, assaulting, arresting, and removing the unarmed Wet'suwet'en people from their land. This followed a similar invasion of the Yintah by the RCMP in January 2019, where tactical police attacked another blockade, arresting 14 Indigenous land defenders. The Guardian later revealed the RCMP had stated that the raid required lethal overwatch, and in a mask-off moment deemed arrest necessary for sterilizing the site.
The Wet'suwet'en protest was basically what ended up becoming Canada's own version of Standing Rock in the United States, complete with, police brutality, natives standing up for their rights to their land. But you want to know what the kicker is that almost never made the news? They were not opposed to the idea of a pipeline. They just wanted it rerouted, saying, look, we're not opposed to the pipeline, just please don't build it through your proposed route because that goes through a very ecologically sensitive area, and it's also a place of great spiritual significance to our people and our ancestors. That was it. We couldn't reroute a pipeline, and instead had to respond with police brutality and violence.
It's true, despite the planned route crossing through unceded territory, Coastal GasLink rejected the alternate route proposed by the hereditary chiefs, claiming that the added $600 million cost would negatively impact the viability of the $6.6 billion project. They also wanted to avoid the settler towns along the rerouted path because of construction disruption and operational safety reasons, but I didn't see them claim the same considerations were given to the Wet'suwet'en Yintah, seemingly content to destroy the land and cultural artifacts of the region, which sparked a host of solidarity protests and blockades in support of the land defenders.
Rail blockades started happening nearly everywhere else in Canada because a lot of railway lines go through native land.
Protests and rail blockades sprung up from coast to coast in an effort to shut down Canada. And even with vigilante settlers and further violence and arrests by police, well, it worked. And this movement kept the pressure on right through the nation-to-nation negotiations.
There is now a clear playbook for radical activists to follow.
When you're right, you're right.
That's amazing, and that's good, but it's also shameful that it had to get to that point over a rerouted pipeline before Canadians started to pay attention.
The rail blockades in particular really seemed to annoy the capitalist and political class, who put their ignorance on display by claiming rule of law again and again. They were practically celebrating their disregard for Indigenous laws.
Part of that rule of law is Section 35, which is Aboriginal rights and title, and also the rights of Indigenous people to have free, prior, and informed consent.
Who knew? Acting like there is just one rule of law ignores the Canadian Constitution, Supreme Court rulings, and British and French laws before them, all of which recognize the Indigenous governance and laws that ruled here from time immemorial. Which brings us right back around to the Wet'suwet'en conflict, and why this movement was so necessary, which in the end got the Canadian government to agree to a memorandum of understanding that will resolve the rights and title outstanding from the 1997 Delgamuukw Superior Court case.
But it's still pretty damning of the government that they did absolutely nothing. Trudeau didn't meet with these elders. They didn't really, beyond, token platitudes, try and fix the situation. All this over an inability by a company to reroute a pipeline around sacred land.
And if all this sounds a little too familiar, too recent, it might be because there was a similar story on the East Coast.
So we're going to revisit the whole Mi'kmaq moderate livelihood lobster fishing crisis that happened earlier and to a certain extent is still going on.
This all stemmed from the Peace and Friendship Treaties from 1760-61 and the Supreme Court's 1999 Marshall decision, which recognized that the Mi'kmaq right to fish out of season in order to maintain a moderate livelihood. But they've been persecuted for acting on that right year after year because the courts and Canadian government never defined what a moderate livelihood was.
It was once again up to the natives to really try and secure their own rights and future.
So they did just that. Sabanagati First Nation launched their own self-regulated fishery with a handful of licenses, followed by a couple more Mi'kmaq fisheries around Nova Scotia. But the commercial fishers didn't like this, and the locals, well, they weren't buying.
The first stories I did were in Burnt Church. You know, the Marshall decision had upheld treaty rights, the Mi'kmaq went fishing, and then all hell broke loose. Here we are 21 years later, and you're hearing that same sort of battle cry from commercial fishermen in southwest Nova Scotia. They're going to ruin the lobster stocks.
And so the commercial fishers did just that, and over the weeks that followed, they began intimidating and assaulting the Mi'kmaq. A suspicious burned boat escalated quickly to a burned van and a mob at their lobster pound. Hundreds of lobsters were destroyed, showing maybe conservation was never really the concern. It all culminated in the burning of a Mi'kmaq lobster pound, while the RCMP stood by and did nothing.
People surrounded another lobster pound. Mi'kmaq lobster harvester Jason Marr was trapped inside.
There's hundreds of them and the cops are with them saying I should leave and let them take my lobsters.
Police can be seen standing by as crates of lobster are removed. Marr said about 3,000 pounds of lobster was destroyed.
We had to witness cops whose job it is to keep the peace and make arrests when crimes are committed and protect people from violence and terrorism. When that is their literal only job, they stood by and did nothing.
After the RCMP stood back and stood by while illegal acts went on around them, the best Indigenous Services Minister, Mark Miller, would do is say police let down the Mi'kmaq, until finally, 2 months later, the RCMP made an arrest of 21 arsonists.
The cops finally decided to make 21 arrests in conjunction with at least the arson attack. Still no word fully on the various other acts of intimidation and terrorism they committed against Indigenous people trying to seek a moderate livelihood.
Right, and as we saw, the Mi'kmaq are within their rights while not harming lobster stocks. The conservation argument was quickly put to bed by scientists and experts from Dalhousie University.
The Mi'kmaq have a management plan in place that is, ensuring conservation, and that what the Mi'kmaq are doing is a drop in the bucket compared to the commercial fishery.
By the numbers, it's truly a fraction of a fraction. And when we zoom out from the inshore, we see just how dominant Clearwater are offshore. It's clear that their monopoly over the industry here is the root of the conflict. But then,
the natives also absolutely bossed up when they decided to get together and talk it out with their community and then engage in negotiations with Clearwater, which is a major seafood company. And they bought, I believe, like an ever so slim majority stake in it, which means in the wake of intimidation and outright domestic terrorism directed against them, the natives came back as the white people's bosses. That is amazing.
in a Shyamalan-level twist, it was announced that months-long negotiations led to Clearwater being purchased by a coalition of Mi'kmaq First Nations and the company Premium Brands. This community-based investment will lead to far more than a moderate livelihood for many, but it's also worth acknowledging that Premium Brands are known to be a serial acquirer. The conglomerate are on a kind of predatory capitalist mission, having acquired more than 40 brands that hawk factory-farmed meat and seafood. So it's more of a keep your enemies close situation, I guess? Anyway, both of those stories have direct ties to our next one.
Canada is finally implementing the UNDRIP or UNDRIP declaration. But here's why it's bothering me today. The NDP proposed it first, and the government said no.
The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007 by almost all members of the General Assembly except Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. I can't imagine why. Ultimately adopted by Harper in 2010 as an aspirational document, in 2018 the declaration was finally put forward as a private member's bill C-262 by former NDP MP Romeo Saganash, one of the original architects of the UN Declaration itself.
The UN Declaration is the most comprehensive international human rights document that deals specifically with the rights of Indigenous peoples, their political rights, their economic rights, their cultural rights, their environmental rights, and even, I would add, Mr. Speaker, their spiritual rights. So Bill C-262 proposes all of that.
And while Conservatives proudly opposed the bill, the Liberals got over their initial hesitation and ultimately voted to support it, which would have made Canada the first country to align our laws with the 46 articles of UNDRIP. But because the Liberals left it as a private member's bill, rather than adopting it as government policy, it was sent to the back of the line with the other opposition bills.
Why would we support another party's legislation? It's not like we're supposed to work together and compromise and things like that and consent on the will of the governed or anything like that.
And when it made its way to the Senate, the Conservative pushback continued, with procedural tactics like adjournments and filibusters stalling a bill that already had its days numbered by the looming election. All because Conservatives were peddling a false narrative that the articles that call for free, prior, and informed consent constitute a veto, which showed that the senators don't understand that these rights are already inherent to Indigenous peoples, and their consent is required by Canada's own constitution and treaties anyway. So even with the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report urging its passing only weeks before, Bill C-262 died on the Senate's to-do list. And with 2020's Bill C-15, the right-wing premiers are peddling that same veto narrative again.
It also bothers me that 6 out of 10 provinces, including some of the major ones, decided, oh no, this would be a bad thing because guess what? Yeah, our laws negatively impact Indigenous people. They were kind of designed to do that in the first place.
But Northwest Territories are looking to implement their own UNDRIP legislation, so are the Ontario NDP, following in the footsteps of the BC NDP who passed it unanimously in 2019. And it's worth taking a closer look at that aspirational rather than directional bill, because as we saw with the Wet'suwet'en conflict, the government chose to enforce the court injunction rather than using the tools of UNDRIP to resolve the conflict via consensus, which meant Coastal GasLink's impact and benefit agreement took precedence over international Indigenous rights, and these same fears are resurfacing with Bill C-15. It's important to remember that Canada supports the non-binding UN declaration, so between that, our constitution, and our treaties, the rights of Indigenous peoples already exist, but federal and provincial governments refuse to respect them. The Liberals are leaning into the colonial interpretation by reverting to a Canadian definition of the declaration with Bill C-15.
It's not really implementing the UN declaration, plus they're trying to take the UN Declaration and put it in under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. So in other words, rather than respecting international law, they're domesticating, a Canadian definition of the UN Declaration and trying to basically interpret it to the status quo policies and laws that they're implementing now. So there's not really a change if this law passes, and that's the problem. Article 46, which talks about state sovereignty and territorial integrity, that the UN Declaration can't be interpreted to affect those things. And that's what the grassroots are really worried about, is Canadian sovereignty trumping Indigenous sovereignty.
So grassroots groups like the AIA are opposing the bill as written, which enshrines UNDRIP within the Constitution Section 35 and the doctrine of discovery, a colonial provision that strips Indigenous peoples of their sovereignty and land rights, meaning it's not so much nation to nation as it is nations within nation.
Nowhere in those treaties did any of us that I know of give up our title, our sovereignty. When you think of it outside the constitutional box, there is no reason for us to have our rights enshrined in anybody's constitution except our own. And we have our own rights. We have our own title. And this new legislation is a step away. In fact, it's running away from that.
And we want to be running towards things like the land back movement. 1492 Land Back Lane and the previously mentioned Wet'suwet'en and Mi'kmaq claims each show the way forward and lay the foundation for a truly intersectional leftist movement that can achieve true reconciliation and end systemic discrimination in our society. Because despite what people like Maxime Bernier and Erin O'Toole would say, systemic racism is an ongoing issue in Canada, which brings us to our next story.
Eternal Maple Mega douche bro Maxime Bernier had the audacity to suggest recently that there's no wave of white supremacy and neo-Nazism in Canada. That's just not a thing we do here.
In response to Jagmeet Singh's statement that accurately points out the number of active right-wing extremist groups in Canada, PPC leader Maxime Bernier claimed there's no wave of white supremacy. And then came Matthew Green with the dunk of the year, saying that one of his parliamentary highlights was witnessing his NDP caucus mate move into the former office of this chud.
People like Maxime Bernier are dangerous, and they're out there in Canada. Now, thankfully, as we saw in the last election, Bernier lost, and his People's Party of Canada didn't seem to get too many votes, and they didn't get a single person in. But that doesn't mean that their supporters still aren't out there, and that they're still not frothing at the mouth mad about everything under the sun.
Thankfully, Bernier lost again in this year's by-elections with a measly 3% of the vote. But Bothered Boy is right, and the racist far-right movement is growing online, with Canada ranking among the worst for active users in white supremacist groups worldwide. Well over 6,000 of these groups, pages and forums in fact. The ISD report released this year says the number of groups operating in Canada has tripled over the past 5 years, with most participating in ethno-nationalism, anti-Muslim hate, and white supremacy, including many in Bernier's base. The pink dots here represent those accounts who were traced as active supporters of the PPC, well distributed throughout this ecosystem.
ISD found nearly 7,000 right-wing extremist pages, groups, users, and channels in Canada with a wide reach, 11 million users worldwide.
Canada ranks up there in the top 3 with the US and the UK in terms of active members. So I think that will come as a real surprise.
Anti-Muslim hostility and hatred were among the most common topics. And in the wake of the most recent anti-racist protests, ISD is also starting to document evidence of groups targeting Black people too.
This comes as no surprise really, with people of many East Asian nationalities being targeted with anti-Chinese attacks in response to COVID-19 and propaganda peddled by these white supremacist groups. Or take conservatives like Jason Kenney who let anti-maskers off the hook while blaming Asian people.
There's even Erin O'Toole there with his slogan of "Take Back Canada" or "Take Canada Back." From who exactly?
As attacks on the Mi'kmaq people show, I don't think O'Toole is leading a pro-Indigenous sovereignty movement in response to centuries of systemic oppression, which was made more clear when he told a Zoom call of Ryerson students that the residential school program was only meant to provide education, and it just became horrible. After backlash, O'Toole's office said this champion of reconciliation cares deeply about combating cancel culture, but not the kind of cancel culture of the residential schools that even former leader Stephen Harper apologized for, acknowledging that the primary objective of the schools was to isolate children from their families and culture, based on the assumption that Indigenous cultures and beliefs were inferior to those of settlers.
From coast to coast, whether it's directed against natives, Muslims, Black people, Asians, wherever you go in this vast country of ours, you will find racism.
And you'll be surprised to learn that our military and police forces struggle to find and define hate and racism, many outright denying that it exists in institutions like the RCMP. Cue our next story.
And we have to look into our own communities. Police kill Black people in Toronto at 20 times the rate that they do white people. The Indigenous population in Canada is a fraction of the entire population, yet Indigenous people make up 30% of the federal prison population. This is a country stolen by white settlers from Indigenous peoples who were here for millennia. Who are we kidding when we contrast ourselves to the United States?
We don't talk enough about the BLM movement in Canada and how it's a bit different because America has its history of racism against Black people to deal with. Canada has that too. But ours, in terms of what's more prominent, is our history of racism against Indigenous people.
Systemic racism is rampant throughout our police, government, and economic system, disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and racialized people more broadly, with an obvious answer to end these murders: defund the police.
The Black Lives Matter movement in Canada it's been around for a while, but it did achieve serious traction with the George Floyd protests.
Solidarity protests were bolstered by calls for local justice because around that time, Regis Korchinski-Paquette fell from her balcony while allegedly under care from police who were there for a wellness check.
So then the discussion in Canada started to shift very notably, not just towards mistreatment of minorities under police in Canada, but also mental health and mental health services.
There were several deaths during wellness checks caused by or committed by police, allegedly. Chantel Moore, killed in Edmundston, New Brunswick, followed by Ijaz Chowdhury, killed by Peel Police, much like DeAndre Campbell back in April, around the same time as Aisha Hudson was killed. And while not every wellness check ended fatally, the RCMP were sure to bring axes and steel-toe boots. All in all, 34 of the 55 people shot by police this year were killed by their actions. The vast majority were young men, with about 1 in 5 identified as Black and half as Indigenous. Zoom out to the past 20 years, and we see that more than 70% of the nearly 500 people killed by police had a mental health issue or struggled with addiction specifically. So something has to be done that doesn't involve police, who have proven to escalate issues, with experts agreeing that funding mental health services over police is one way forward, something that status quo leaders aren't so keen on.
All these politicians and leaders of these institutions are giving us words while trying to maintain the right to use violence against us. We need to disarm and defund police and give the money that we're spending on them, billions of dollars, to the actual communities that we always say there isn't enough money for services, there isn't enough money for childcare and food programs. You know why? Because it's all with the police. And until we challenge their authority, we're not going to change anything.
Police budgets continue to climb each year, the largest spend by municipalities nationwide, making up 25% of the Winnipeg budget and over 23% of Toronto's budget, billed at $1.2 billion. The 5-year plan has seen increases across the board, but looking at the past 30 years, we see that per capita spending has increased 45% to over $15 billion nationally in 2018. Even just the RCMP occupation of Wet'suwet'en lands cost us $13 million, but I don't see any fiscal conservatives calling out that waste of money.
And so the good thing to come out of this is that a very slim majority of Canadians actually want to defund the police. That is good news.
An Ipsos poll this summer found that 51% of Canadians already want to defund, with the policy heavily supported by millennials at 63% and even more among Zoomers at 77%. So the momentum is with the movement, and its calls to defund, disarm, dismantle, and abolish are already making headway. Halifax cancelled its order of an armored vehicle in favor of community funds, while city councils in Calgary and Edmonton voted to cut $20 million and $11 million from their budgets. But others, like Montreal's mayor, said she's open to defunding but wants to talk it through. Vancouver's police board rejected the measly 1% cut supported by the councillors, and Toronto's council voted down a 10% cut, opting to spend millions more on body cams instead. And of course, it goes without saying that the feds are still ducking their responsibility to act.
But it's still very polarizing, and the fact that there aren't more Canadians who would be in support of defunding the police and allocating a lot of their, budgets and funding into resources for mental health and healthier, safer communities is definitely what's bothering me today.
Our next story shows where some of that funding could go, which brings us to the halfway point, and we're going to have to pause here. Check back next week to see the final 5 stories, and in the meantime, head over to What's Bothering Me Today's channel, go subscribe and watch his companion video featuring some honorable mentions that didn't make the cut. The links for that and his Patreon are below. I want to thank him again for helping me rant about these first 5 topics, and to my patrons who support the creation of these videos. Please like and subscribe, and comment below what you think the other 5 stories will be. I'll see you all next week, and until then, always waffle to the left.